It's an overcast day in London, 2005, October. There's a press conference on the HMS Presidents, the HQ of London's Royal Naval Preserve. In the background, the iconic Tower Bridge looms over the event. The press area is lined with photographers as a small Royal Marine speedboat makes its way up the River Thames. A man, blonde, 37 at the time, wearing a crisp black suit with an awkward blue life jacket, makes his way up the dock. He pauses in front of the photographers. Everyone wants to get the first, best shots. He's James Bond, and today's his first day on the job. Daniel Craig's unveiling as Bond was, in his own words, a train wreck. The sky was gray and so was the water. People complained that he was too blonde and not tall enough. The life jacket ruined any sense of style that came from the speedboat introduction. It wasn't even a well-kept secret. In fact, as early as February of that year, he had been a top contender to take on the mantle. The news even broke officially a day prior to the event, a leak coming from an unexpected source. Craig's own mother, who was just really excited he got the role. But even with the blunders and the awkwardness, it was a spectacle filled with tradition. The location of the conference was, according to Bond's original author, Ian Fleming, 007's spiritual home. They even continued the tradition of appointing the latest Bond actor the role of honorary commander in the Royal Navy, a position held by the fictional character. Daniel Craig joins a long line of Bonds: Connery, Lazenby, Moore, Dalton, Brosnan, each of them bringing their own style and flair to the role. Craig's expectation was the same. One of the questions asked at his induction began by stating that every boy dreams of playing Bonds. The interviewer asks if he's looking forward to becoming a legend. Daniel Craig's response is simple.
Oh, I don't know about that.
For the first time in the history of the character, two different actors will be James Bond, but in different forms. One is Patrick Gibson, who provides the voice, likeness, and motion capture for IO Interactive's ongoing 007 video game series. The other will be Daniel Craig's replacement as the cinematic Bonds, launching a new lineage of films for this new generation. And yet neither are set in stone. IO Interactive's 007's future beyond First Light remains uncertain. The new cinematic Bond actor is yet to be chosen. We're living in a James Bond limbo, where there's two of him and none at all. As a result, the face of Bond is unclear. With Craig's tenure at an end, he joins 5 others fighting for the role of best former Bond. With Gibson's uncertain future in more digital form, it's hard to say if he's really James Bond. And with auditions still being held for the next Bond film, the current 007 might just be a casting call. But it's at this intersection where a question becomes important, a question that decides much more than who gets to be a legend. A question that asks who gets to be a national symbol, a hero for the everyday person to look up to, a role model that young men aspire to be. Who gets to be James Bond? Daniel Craig wasn't the only Bond actor to get a ceremonial introduction.
From now on, just call him 007.
Back in 1994, Pierce Brosnan was unveiled as the 5th actor to step into the role at a press conference at the Regent Hotel. Only 2 days later, kids were recognizing him as 007. The 4th Bond, Timothy Dalton, didn't get to have a press conference until they'd already started shooting Dalton's first film. He'd been cast shortly before production began. In fact, Dalton's casting as Bond was a backup of a backup. He'd been offered the role already but had turned it down due to other commitments. So they asked Brosnan, offering the role for a second time, as he'd been approached for A View to a Kill before The Living Daylights, but needing to pass on both. So when Dalton was approached once more, he said yes, finally worn down. But he too had been offered the role much earlier. In fact, Dalton had been approached 5 times for different 007 films, starting with On Her Majesty's Secret Service in 1969. Prior to Craig, Brosnan, and Dalton, Roger Moore in 1972 enjoyed a special press photo shoot on the roof of the Dorchester Hotel in London. Papers reported that Moore was told by Ian co-producer Harry Saltzman to get his hair cut. After all, according to Saltzman, Bond wasn't just a civilian, he was a commander, one whose image had been carefully maintained for years. Back in this era, playing Bond wasn't a guarantee of legendary status. In fact, Moore's predecessor, George Lazenby, had turned down a 7-film contract, convinced that the role would live and die with Bond's original actor, Sean Connery. 6 Bonds, 14 books, 25 Eon productions, 2 more non-Eon adaptations, over 30 007 video games, newspaper strips, comic book issues, graphic novels, radio dramas, and countless parody films, including one parody franchise that's even a household name.
Oh, behave.
The Bond empire is practically a living, breathing organism. It is the second longest running film series of all time, just behind Godzilla, and joining the ranks of Superman and Dracula is one of the longest running media franchises ever. The character of James Bond is unmistakable, but it didn't wind up that way by chance. Like Harry Saltzman said back in 1972, Bond isn't just a civilian, he is an image, an icon, a symbol with roots that stretch back far before the first Bond book was ever written. Because 007 is just one rung on a ladder, a single step in a tradition of spy fiction that precedes Bond's introduction by 50 years. So who was the first James Bond? If you were to ask the average person who the fictional symbols of England are, Bond would only be one example. Another made his way onto the page 60 years prior.
Elementary, my dear Watson. This man has been...
Sherlock Holmes was the character that dominated the end of the 19th century. Preceding Count Dracula by a full decade, the legendary detective made his start in Arthur Conan Doyle's serialized novel, originally published in 1887. Come 1891, Doyle shifted towards short stories and quickly became an international sensation, with a character that everyone was keen on. Holmes was smart and classy. He was polite and chivalrous. The original publications of Sherlock Holmes featured a much more approachable man than is often portrayed today. He had a warm yet eccentric personality that perfectly matched the sensibility of the Victorian Englishman. He also inspired copycats, countless copycats. Even in spite of Holmes' modern-day popularity, we're still seeing versions of him pop up, everything from Edgar Allan Poe's Kogoro Akechi novels to House MD is a direct interpretation or adaptation of Sherlock Holmes.
You look smashing, Miss Moneypenny.
In fact, the fictional detective's first franchise rivals were being created as early as the 1890s, during the height of Holmes' popularity. Such is the case with one particular writer, a French-English journalist named William Le Queux. Le Queux was an accomplished writer who likened himself as a rival to Arthur Conan Doyle. First reaching a level of notoriety with his 1897 novel, The Great War in England, Le Queux would quickly become a household name due to his intense novels about the tensions between England and its closest rivals. This tension would quickly graduate to a secret war being fought in the shadows. Espionage. But it wasn't until 1903 that Le Queux had his Holmes competitor, a spy named Duckworth Drew. Duckworth Drew was both a rival and a distorted copy of Sherlock Holmes. An unmistakably brilliant, classy bachelor, Drew enjoyed many of the same habits as Holmes, including a preference towards pipes and whiskey sodas. But Duckworth Drew differed in his particular origins. Unlike Doyle, Le Queux was a writer of war, so Drew had to have a profession to match. So Duckworth Drew became a spy, but not in so many words. Often, Drew will refer to himself as a diplomatic freelancer or a secret agent. Because espionage wasn't pretty back then. When performed by an enemy of the crown, it was often considered an evil, deceitful act. Men who lurked in the shadows, without honor, ungentlemanlike. But not Duckworth Drew. No, Drew was a man of posture, a man who the king respected. He was a gentleman and a scholar, a hero for the English that was unafraid to soil his hands if it meant the safety of his crown and country. Duckworth Drew was a spy, but his morals and class made it easy to ignore. It also made it that much easier to make him a national symbol. Like Holmes, Duckworth Drew quickly became a totem of England's authority in the world. And during his tenure, as tensions between England and Germany began to rise, Duckworth Drew's secret fight against foreign powers only steadily grew in relevance. Drew became a hero to turn to when the paranoia of the Germans crept into the country, and Le Queux was more than willing to stir the pot. In one of his memoirs, Le Queux writes,
I think I can claim to be the first person to warn Great Britain that the Kaiser was planning a war against us.
He claimed that the revelations of a close friend living in Berlin had led him to discover a great network of German espionage across Great Britain.
I came back from Germany and endeavoured to awaken public opinion concerning the peril, but my voice was, Alas, that you've one crying in the wilderness. Spies! What on earth did Germany want to spy on us for?
While LeQueux's suspicions were accurate to the increasingly hostile climate between the two countries, his revelations were nothing but the fabrications of a paranoid xenophobe. But a paranoid xenophobe in charge of a cultural hero is a powerful xenophobe. It didn't take long for LeQueux to be prompted to write propaganda for the looming war. Stirring up anti-German sentiment became more and more important, and the war-obsessed LeQueux was more than happy to detail elaborate plans, ways that he thought the Germans would invade. An increasing level of xenophobia only made LeQueux and Duckworth Drew more famous, the fictional spy becoming an outlet for the general populace's fears. Ultimately, it reached a level that was almost ironic. The public's continuous letters about LeQueux's effective propaganda would lead to the formation of the British Secret Service in 1909. Life imitates fiction, I guess. From this point on, the floodgates had been opened. Spy fiction writers from all walks of life began to pour out of the cracks, and the government followed closely behind, a pen and paper in hand for propaganda contracts. John Buchan, one of the most famous espionage novelists of the early 1900s, was specifically commissioned to write anti-German propaganda. Dennis Wheatley was recruited by the Future Operational Planning section to write strategic deception for World War II. Even the beloved Ian Fleming, author of the Bond novels, was tasked with writing covert psychological deception, though this was a decade before his famous spy would make his first appearance. The spy novel and propaganda go hand in hand. It makes perfect sense that depictions of the righteous yet classy vigilante would be used to show that the wars being fought were the right ones. After all, if a symbol of England has no problems getting his hands dirty when it comes to the opposition, who were we to argue? But xenophobic propaganda has its limits. After the end of World War II, Fleming was already brainstorming his national symbol, but without a war to fight, Bond wouldn't have an enemy. Fortunate for him that the Cold War began. I think when a lot of people think of Bond, they think of him as a symbol of Cold War propaganda. After all, the primary antagonist of Fleming's own novels was SMERSH, a Soviet counterintelligence agency whose acronym meant, roughly, death to spies. SMERSH was a real organization that operated during the end of World War II, providing Bond with a real-world threat, though one that had been dismantled before the novels were released. But still, SMERSH's role in the Bond books cemented him as a legendary anti-Russian Cold War agent. There's even a moment in GoldenEye where Judi Dench, as M, calls out Bond for this.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War, whose boyish charms, though wasted on me, obviously appeal to that young woman I sent out to evaluate you.
It's not hard to see the ways in which Bond might be used to drum up pro-England sympathies during a war that was fought primarily through non-direct confrontation. But part of Bond's success as a symbol of propaganda wasn't just making the Soviet Union the enemy, but providing an everyman to root for. One thing about Duckworth Drew that distinguishes him from James Bond is his social class. Drew was first and foremost wealthy. He was well-traveled, enjoyed the luxuries of aristocrats, and became increasingly modeled after LeQueux's own lavish life. This helped to sanitize the image of Drew as a spy. After all, if even the affluent could lurk in the shadows, then British espionage must not be so bad. But Bond, despite being a direct descendant of Duckworth Drew's style of espionage, could hardly be called upper class. While Bond gets to enjoy the finer things in life during his many missions, he's explicitly middle class. Unlike the titular man with the golden gun in the 1974 film starring the brilliant Christopher Lee, Bond wasn't making $1 million for every contract.
You work for peanuts. A hearty well done.
In fact, according to Fleming in 1955, Bond only made £1,500 a year. Today, that's only $62,000 a year. I've got several friends who make more than that. Most of them still live with roommates. Bond makes as much money as pretty much any middle-class individual. And while he's got a bit of extra financing in the form of an inheritance from his dead parents and funding from the government for his missions, 007 isn't quite the aristocrat that Duckworth Drew was. While Bond is classy, he's sometimes crude, arrogant, and not afraid to get his hands dirty. And while half a century later, these qualities make him a bit regressive, back in the day, he was the opposite. Back in the day, James Bond was woke. It feels pretty hard to avoid the word woke when it comes to modern AAA video games. Choices from developers that prioritize cultural and social diversity are quick to net a game the label of woke, whether that's making Ellie a lesbian in The Last of Us or giving Aloy normal hair. Okay. So when the accusations that 007 First Light was a woke game started to make their way onto the internet, no one was really surprised. People complained about M, Bond's superior, being a woman of color. They complained about the same thing with Moneypenny, the 00 program handler. They said that Patrick Gibson's Bond was too much of a pansy, being ordered around by women in spite of them being, in charge. But I think in particular players latched onto the idea that it was Bond that was woke. Not just a regular video game protagonist, but a spy with a license to kill. But Daniel Craig's Bond films feature a lot of the same quote-unquote woke elements that First Light contains. Moneypenny is played by a black actress in both, played by Naomi Harris in the modern Bond films and Keira Lester in First Light. M had also been played by a woman since 1995 when Judi Dench stepped into the role, before Ray Fiennes took over to finish out Craig's tenure. Bond has been woke for a while, but the reality is that James Bond, the character, has never not been. I know that's a bold statement. Oh my god, Juniper Bloom said that James Bond has always been woke. Is she crazy? But the truth came from Ian Fleming's own mouth. Bond is left of the center just slightly, but enough to contrast Fleming's own political opinions. In fact, Bond contrasted Fleming's opinions so much that his own wife refused to have the book dedicated to her. She thought it was filth. Because the wealthy and affluent didn't read books like the ones Fleming wrote. They were too violent, too sexually liberatory, too provocative. While today, early Bond is often called out for its misogynistic and occasionally racist depictions, back in the day, Bond pushed boundaries. His antics preceded the sexual revolution in the 1960s. The stories often placed women and people of marginalized identities in powerful positions. In fact, the first cleaned-up versions of the Bond books were produced with Fleming's consent and approval before his death in 1966, removing some of the more archaic racial and misogynistic stereotypes. Fleming actually preferred these types of versions over his originals. The films would continue this trend. Spectre, the evil spy organization that dominated much of 1960s Bond culture, was added specifically to replace Smersh as the primary antagonistic force. As the Cold War tensions continued to lax, and productions wanted the Bond films to be movies that could be enjoyed anywhere in the world, even Soviet Russia, Spectre, as a neutral organization whose motivations lay in power and wealth, could be made as evil as they wanted while keeping the Bond films primarily non-political. When illegal battle stripped Eon Productions' rights to use the organization in the films, the enemies became crime lords and political defectors. While they often had Soviet roots, the KGB and Soviet Russia were generally depicted as rivals or even strained allies to MI6. Still, it's difficult to deny that the Bond films haven't aged well. Connery's era contained numerous misogynistic and racist depictions that, while they may have been okay back then, certainly aren't today. The following decades of Bond films were a bit slow to update the character from his origins, but from Connery to every Bond actor that followed, the films did their best to keep 007 relatable. So First Light's interpretation of Bond being a bit left of center may have thrown off those who, for some reason, want the archaic, sexist Bond back. But many on both sides of the political spectrum were surprised to see the direction that First Light did take. That direction was not very different from how Bond has always been. Patrick Gibson's Bond is an average guy, one with a sense of justice, one that's got style and swagger. The ladies love him, though he's usually too focused on the mission.
Say, there is a quaint little bar nearby with a 9-feet mahogany table. I get off at 10 in case you feel like losing some money.
Duty calls, I'm afraid. Some other time.
He's sometimes crude, arrogant, and not afraid to get his hands dirty. He's a politically charged person, and yet he's very relatable. Frankly, he's my Bond. He's not dissimilar from many of my actual friends. It feels surprising that James Bond could be someone I see myself knowing. An average guy who makes an average ways thrust into a world of high-tech gadgets and international conspiracy. But that's exactly why he's always been so relatable, a character that many could aspire to be, or at least wish they could be. There isn't a pretense of high-class status or being bred for the role. Bond is just a guy. But still, he's a guy whose image is carefully curated. The production of Bond films has been a family business since the beginning. Promised between two men, Albert "Hubby" Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, as they invested pretty much everything they had in trying to get a 007 film off the ground. It's where Eon comes from, everything or nothing. They were massively successful, of course, despite a few changes and hiccups along the way. Eon was led by Saltzman, Cubby, and Cubby's children until 2025, when creative control was sold to Amazon MGM Studios. We'll get to that later. All that time, Eon had been a family business. Writers and partners have come and gone, but the intentionality behind Bond has largely remained the same for the 60-some years he's been on the screen. Every shift in style and personality has been an intentional choice of the Broccoli family, including Craig's James Blonde, whose gritty, modern, and much more serious style was an attempt to reground the series after 9/11. So if Bond's gotten woker, I've got bad news for the haters. He's supposed to be that way. This intentionality behind creating Bond to always be approachable, if slightly left of center, is what has managed to cause the character to feel both archaic and timeless. When you watch a Bond film of the era, he always just seems like a guy you might know. Sure, one that's a bit too serious and remarkably good at card games, but with a sense of humor and heart that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find in one of the world's deadliest men. Some Bonds have pushed the envelope on this a little bit. Daniel Craig's Bond always felt much more like Jason Bourne or Brian Mills, while Ethan Hunt took up the mantle of most relatable agent in cinema for a while. But that's the thing, depictions of Bond are so famous that we often think more of the actor's portrayals rather than the character himself. But at the same time, when you relate to a depiction of Bond, whether that's in the movies or in the games, it's not Daniel Craig or Patrick Gibson or Pierce Brosnan. You see, it's James Bond. The character transcends the actor. It's the portrayal that you're exposed to, the modern one gracing your screen that you understand as Bond. It's why those born in the 80s and early 90s see Pierce Brosnan as the quintessential Bond. It's why Gen Z is struggling with the idea that Daniel Craig will no longer be Bond. It's why, after I finished First Light, I felt like I was saying goodbye to a friend. But that's all by design, a carefully curated character to inspire you, to make you feel like you've known him your whole life. But who gets to decide what that looks like? IO Interactive is the latest developer to take a crack at the Bond franchise, but they're not exactly new to Secret Agents. They're the team responsible for the Hitman series, a game franchise that's been the core of their production since the first game released in the year 2000s. In the Hitman games, he plays Agent 47, a mysterious assassin employed by the ICA, or International Contract Agency, a neutral organization that's often employed by various government agencies, usually Western ones, to eliminate strategic targets to prevent all-out war. While the ICA is a criminal, non-political agency, they're often portrayed as the good guys, usually working as vigilantes that do the necessary dirty work for a good amount of money. The games work by having the player operate as Agent 47 in semi-sandbox environments, tasked with taking down the target by any means necessary. And since the ICA are the good guys, those targets are usually evil, corrupt, or just on the wrong side of history. It makes it easier for the game to justify the sometimes grim act of ritualistically murdering people for points. There's a reason why the games are rated M. But what's unique about the Hitman games is the freedom you have to decide how you're going to eliminate the target. Your method could be as simple as strangling them when you get them alone in a room, or you might wind up knocking out every enemy in an area because you got a little in over your head, and at some point it was just too fun to stop. There are also scripted stories that you can engage with that guide the player towards an execution in a much more spy-friendly way. There's even a VR mode, which I spent a lot of time with. But beyond 47's cold gaze and the whole gamification of murder, the Hitman series is largely a deconstruction of James Bond. While 47 is a contract assassin, he is involved with espionage work from time to time, taking on the task of gathering information or engaging in sabotage. The player rarely gets to engage in this kind of activity, but 47's reconnaissance is referenced on occasion. 007 might have begun as a straightforward spy or a secret agent, but his role as a government-sanctioned assassin increased as the series went on. It's what the 00 stands for. It's not because he's the 7th agent in a string of hundreds. No, it's his license to kill. 00 status. Like Bond, 47 engages in disguise to achieve his goals. Like Bond, 47 travels the world in tailored suits, frequenting luxury locations. Like Bond, 47 gets to use a range of gadgets, including exploding ducks. If Bond was a deconstruction of Duckworth Drew, 47 is a deconstruction of Bond, stripping away the political affiliation, the branding, the arrogance, leaving only Bond's basest form as an elusive killer, who sometimes wears a clown costume. It's because of all this that it came as no surprise when IO Interactive was announced as the developer for the next Bond game. It was the perfect choice. Many Hitman levels feel like they're pulled straight from 007's world, albeit with a bit of a drier tone and more ruthless action. In fact, IO Interactive was chosen to do Bond after they demoed one of their levels, the Sapienza level in Hitman 2016, where they modeled Daniel Craig's face and placed it over 47's. You could probably do that with a lot of Hitman levels. I mean, seriously, First Light's Vietnam level feels like a direct descendant of Haven Island. IO Interactive is not the first developer to make a Bond game. The N64's GoldenEye still maintains a certain level of nostalgia. As previously mentioned, there are 33 Bond games including First Light's. The earliest Bond game actually came out in 1982, and it was a text-based adventure a la Zork or The Oregon Trail. Unlike First Light, most of these Bond games starred the film actors of the era. Brosnan was particularly popular for this. But there actually are a few Bond games that depicted Bond as someone we haven't seen before. There were some oddballs prior to 2000. 007 James Bond The Stealth Affair originally featured a US knockoff named John Glames, and the aforementioned text-based game Shaken But Not Stirred was too early to have character arts. But 2001's James Bond Agent Under Fire specifically starred a brand new Bond, in this case Andrew Bicknell, which I guess technically makes Bicknell the 6th Bond portrayal, with Craig and Gibson being 7 and 8, but Bicknell's role in the game was primarily as a stand-in due to Brosnan's then expired license. All of this is to say that 007 First Light is new territory for James Bond, not only because the game is narratively an origin story, but because IO Interactive designed First Light from the ground up, taking inspiration from the film series while trying to return to the DNA of what made the character unique, assembling the pieces in a different way for an interpretation that feels as authentic as any other actor's portrayal. Because IO Interactive didn't make a new Bond, they made a Bond that's extremely respectful of the character's roots. The game oozes references to the works that came before. There's tons of gadgets and QLab ripped straight from the books and the films. Most of the cars in the game came directly from the movies, as well as product placement. Even the score uses some of the themes of other Bond films, including a particularly sweet nod to Honor Majesty's Secret Service during one of the game's action sequences. Of course, IO Interactive was going to make the best possible Bond game. They've been working through the formula of what makes them for like 20 years. They're also Bond fans themselves. Most of the studios cited Brosnan as their Bond, taking direct inspiration from his films and games. They also had some powerful help in creating Bond for the small, playable screen. The idea was originally pitched by IO Interactive directly to Eon Productions, even though Eon was kind of over the whole Bond's video game thing, as past games often failed to do justice to the character's narrative arc. But due to the combination of the sophistication of IOI's gameplay and their eagerness in conveying a new story that explored Bond's origins, they managed to convince Eon that taking the chance would be worth it. So Bond became their game. First Light is a game that has IO Interactive's fingerprints all over it. Its level design is both clearly inspired by many classic Bond layers while staying true to IOI's roots, featuring layers of problem solving and a good amount of stealth. There's action sequences that feel like they're pulled straight from Uncharted, and while they don't always feel perfect, it's unmistakable just how Bond-like they are. Even the story and the characters feel at home in Bond's world. It honestly is the blockbuster 007 game that many have been waiting for, the lost film of the franchise. It's hard to find exact details on the role that Eon had in First Light, whether it was just as a creative advisor during production or if they had more explicit demands that need to be met. One such detail where they might have had an impact is in the casting of James Bond. Patrick Gibson's portrayal might easily solidify him as Bond to many, including myself, but part of the reason he was selected was because Daniel Craig wasn't Bond anymore. It's likely that if the game had been released during Craig's tenure, an actor that more closely resembles him would have been cast. After all, the casting of Bond is a pretty serious thing. The decision has mostly been made by the same people for the entirety of the Bond franchise. Now retired casting director Debbie McWilliams did casting work for every Bond film since 1981's For Your Eyes Only. That's not just Bond either, that's the villains, the Bond girls, Bond's fellow MI6 colleagues, including Q, M, Moneypenny. There's a certain je ne sais quoi about the characters that McWilliams and the rest of the casting crew look for. And that feels explicitly apparent in First Light with celebrities and actors like Gemma Chan, Lenny Kravitz, and Lenny James, a lot of Lennys in this game, making appearances in prominent roles. The casting of every character feels intentional, hopefully because they expect them to stick around, but also probably due to Eon's influence. Bond being a family business, a business that has grown to include developers like IO Interactive, means that there will always be a certain level of confidence behind the decisions made. It's a formula that's been perfected over 60 years, and any shifts and changes are decided for the benefit of not just the producers and the character, but the fans as well. The responsibility of designing a cultural icon, a legend, only grows larger and larger as the character lives on, because Bond won't be so easily forgotten. And neither will the people that play him. It's no wonder that everyone wants to be Bond. It's like being picked first for the dodgeball game. But how do you get to make that decision? How do you decide who to immortalize? Sean Connery is James Bond. At least that's what the posters for Connery's fifth outing, You Only Live Twice, suggested. So Connery leaving the role behind right before the film's premiere was shocking news, even if it wasn't very surprising. Connery had grown increasingly disillusioned with the role, constantly feeling the constraints of fame, while simultaneously not feeling like he was being paid enough for the work involved. But rather than call it there, finishing the series with Connery as Bond, Eon decided they weren't done yet. Broccoli was gonna make these films even without their lead actor. So a casting call went out. Auditions were held with the intent of finding a relatively new actor to fill the role. But there was one actor who didn't really belong. In fact, he wasn't an actor at all. George Lazenby was many things, but prior to his role as Bond and on Her Majesty's Secret Service, a professional actor he was not. An Australian male model, Lazenby had first become acquainted with Bond when he took a date to go see Dr. No at the theater. In his own words, he wasn't just a fan, he was envious of Connery, suggesting that Connery's smooth demeanor stole his date right before his eyes. So when Connery left the role and a casting call went out, Lazenby made it his mission to get the parts. He was bold, brazen, he rushed past the secretary to meet the producers, lying about his lack of acting experience by saying he'd done films in Czechoslovakia and China, places that they couldn't check. When On Her Majesty's Secret Service director Peter Hunt eventually found out that Lazenby was lying, he was more impressed than anything. Lazenby would keep up the charade throughout the audition. They asked him if he could swim. He'd held his breath longer than Connery in Thunderball. Could he ride a horse? Well, he never had, but that didn't stop him from learning on the job. Eventually, Lazenby got the parts. It was pretty much everything he'd ever wanted. He was getting paid money just to go places. He'd get flown around in a helicopter, could get into any club that he wanted to. But it didn't fit. Lazenby's increasing debauchery and suspicion over Broccoli and Sultan's intentions led him to start doubting himself before the film even came out. He felt self-conscious about how much he stuck out like a sore thumb in the 1960s. When the premiere finally came, Lazenby showed up with long hair and a beard in spite of Eon's protests.
I was not the way they wanted their James Bond to be.
They let me go.
I'd blown my shot at being a big famous movie star. I felt that I wasn't wanted anywhere. For a long time, I didn't know who I was. I wanted to be James Bond, but you couldn't live the way James Bond lives.
How do you fill the shoes of the most famous man in Hollywood? Apparently, you don't. After Lazenby's departure, Eon begs for Connery to come back, succeeding in getting him for just one final film. Connery and Lazenby both disillusioned with being Bonds, but in different ways. They're not the only ones, of course.
The fear I had of saying my name is Bond, James Bond. People would say, oh, you're trying to imitate Sean, which I couldn't do. I suddenly had this panic attack. God, what am I going to do if they don't like it?
Eventually, Roger Moore and Sean Connery would go head-to-head when Connery was recruited by a rival producer who had resecured the rights to Thunderball. For the briefest of moments, there were two Bonds, Connery back in Never Say Never Again and Moore in Octopussy. Obviously, Moore's film pulled ahead. After all, there was more to Bond than just the men who play him. What's funny is that Connery wasn't even Fleming's choice for Bond, while nowadays it feels impossible to decouple the two. When Fleming first met Connery, he didn't fit right. He was too muscular, too British, too rugged. It wasn't until the first couple screen tests when Eon saw how women reacted to Connery that they knew they had the right guy. I appreciate these stories about the actors who play Bond because they demonstrate that even when you do become the legend, it's not impossible to still doubt yourself. Lazenby couldn't see himself as Bond, Moore couldn't separate Connery from the role, and Fleming fought against Connery's casting because he wasn't how he saw Bond. The character isn't a blank slate. Every actor that has portrayed him has struggled to fit the role. But they've also struggled to get the role. And in more cases than not, it was their fantasies that led them there. One of my favorite things about LeCue and Duckworth Drew is how the author began to act after his novels started gaining popularity. He started telling people that he was a secret agent, that the books he wrote were based on his real-life experiences, and that's how he always knew just what to say. Of course, this was a fantasy. LeCue had never engaged in any kind of espionage or international affairs other than writing propaganda. But it didn't stop him from imagining himself as Dr. Drew or inserting himself into his books. One of the worst kept secrets about Bond is that Ian Fleming did the same thing. He was once a naval commander just like Bond. His position led him to traveling the world and meeting with foreign powers to plan how best to use deception during World War II. And while he never engaged in the kind of espionage that James Bond often did, he knew the people that did. After the war, he worked in the Sunday Times, overseeing the paper's worldwide network of correspondents. He'd do this for about 9 months of the year, and for the other 3 months he traveled to his vacation home in Jamaica, a hideaway he called Goldeneye. At this beautiful seaside estate, he could envision all the things he wanted to do and the person that he wanted to be. Bond was, in a way, the autobiography of dreams, as Fleming's biographer would put it. Bond and Fleming looked alike. They even shared a taste for fast cars and fine dining. Even Bond's obsession with breakfast, which, if you read a single Bond book, you'll immediately understand, is based on Fleming's own particular tastes. Bond is everything that Fleming wished he could be. He was a projection of his own insecurities and the lack of adventure in his own life. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, writing 101, write what you know. So it makes sense that Fleming would disagree with the casting of Connery as Bond. If he had lived to meet the other Bonds, he probably would have disagreed with the casting of them as well. There would never be a perfect actor for Bond because the perfect actor was, first and foremost, Ian Fleming. But even to Fleming, there was no such thing as perfection.
I've never made Bond out to be a hero, but only a competent professional. That's why I'm amazed to see the teenagers take him up and idolize him.
If even Ian Fleming doesn't see Bond himself as a hero, then maybe we're seeing him wrong. Maybe he was never supposed to be a legend to begin with. After all, he is an everyman. That question posed to Daniel Craig as he became 007 missed an important point. James Bond could be anyone. For the first time in 007's history, the James Bond film franchise will not be under the charge of the Broccoli family. Bond isn't a family business anymore. In fact, it's just another IP under the Amazon umbrella. When Amazon purchased MGM Studios in 2021, they entered the creative ring for the Bond IP. Almost immediately, conflict arose. Amazon wanted to expand Bond beyond films and the occasional game, seeking to create TV spin-offs and more, transforming Bond into a Marvel-sized IP. Eon wasn't happy about that. It's partly the reason it's been so long since the last Bond film. Eon and Amazon just couldn't get along. That all changed in 2025 when Eon sold creative control to Amazon, finally throwing in the towel after years of frustrations. While Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson of Eon still have a stake in the ownership of the character, they're not calling the shots anymore. Amazon is. And Amazon wants a bigger, bolder, blockbuster Bond. And while you might think, hey, if Amazon wants to make a big new Bond film with Villeneuve as the director, that's fine with me. Big Bond films have nearly been great for the series. 1974's The Man with the Golden Gun nearly killed the franchise, and if it wasn't for the immensely successful The Spy Who Loved Me, Bond might have never become a household name. In an era of cinematic blockbusters with longer runtimes, bigger explosions, and more A-list actor names continue to slow down production times and cause increasing desensitization of audience members, James Bond stands to lose everything that he once was. Instead of plucking actors out of obscurity, the next Bond actor could just end up being Brad Pitt. Of course, that's not likely to happen. Odds are the next James Bond will still be someone relatively unknown, or at least that's the belief of Debbie McWilliams. But it's not impossible that 007 could wind up being much less enigmatic, lore fleshed out over television series, novelizations, one actor's portrayal becoming the de facto depiction, forever deciding who James Bond really is. Even IO Interactive's Bond isn't safe from Amazon. While 007 First Light was developed and published in-house, Amazon has regained creative control of James Bond, the video game. They could sack IOI, take over the series, develop and publish new games that mimic the game's success. Patrick Gibson could be replaced like they did with Andrew Bicknell after Brosnan signed a new contract.
Not exactly a surprise. It's been a pleasure, Mom.
While it's unlikely, it's not impossible. Who knows, if you're watching this from the future, you might already know what happens. The next James Bond can only remain uncast for so long, a video game sequel may eventually be announced. But I think there's still a reasonable fear, no matter how far in the future you are, of mega corporations transforming a beloved character into something unrecognizable. Bond could become a parody of himself. He could become more explicit propaganda. It wouldn't be the first time. The face of James Bond could only remain the same for so long. I never watched the Bond films growing up. To me, they were pretentious and archaic. While real-life espionage always seemed cool, 007 felt like a relic of a bygone era. A boys' club you're supposed to get invited into when you're just a kid. And then I watched them. Every single one, even the ones you're not supposed to. And I realized there's so much more to this character than a theme song and a bit outdated demeanor towards women. Patrick Gibson became my James Bond because he shattered my beliefs of what James Bond was. I got to play as a character that was smooth, charming, and most of all, familiar. Someone that's only a stone's throw from my real life. Originally, James Bond was only going to be a section of this essay, but with every new Bond film that I watched, I found myself falling in love with the character more and more. Every silly little gadget, every gorgeous set piece, every stupid name of the Bond girls. I started to realize that I too wanted to be James Bond. You don't get to pick your heroes. More often than not, they wind up in your lives through media saturation and sometimes propaganda. A character designed for mass appeal, either to send a message or just make a buck. But when you're a kid, eyes full of wonder and excitement, you don't know about any of that. The hero on the big screen is just someone you can look up to. Someone who's fighting for what's right. And as you get older, you might realize there's more to this character than what was on the screen, that there's a history that's sometimes problematic, sometimes incredible. But you never lose it, that sense of awe, that respect you have for your heroes. It's a new era of James Bond, one that's uncertain, but no matter what happens, 007's legacy will still be around. And no matter what happens, whoever's selected will still be James Bond. Daniel Craig may have been unsure whether or not he would become a legend, but tons of kids, not just boys but girls too, grew up with him as their hero. They grew up watching him on the screen and thinking, I want to be just like him. And when you watch interviews with the actors, with the game designers, with the producers, you realize that they all felt the same too. Because the answer to who gets to be James Bond has been there all along. It's you.
Mad about the boy. I know it's stupid.
Did you know that 11 Bond films end on boats? 12 if for some reason you consider this video a Bond film, which I hope you do, I guess, but I mean, I'm not holding my breath or anything. I really loved making this video. It went in a completely different direction than I was expecting. In fact, the idea for this was completely different. It was something entirely different. And if you go sign up for my Patreon, you can find out what that idea was. That's right, we're on this part of the video. Welcome to the ending, haha. But yeah, if you're ever curious about how these videos come about, or like if you want like extra content, like maybe a cooking video about me making sea salt ice cream, go check it out. Every dollar helps me to make these silly little videos, and if you can't support me on Patreon, then a like, comment, and subscribe really does make a difference. YouTube considers these kind of things like massive when it comes to promoting and recommending content. But yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.